If I were to ask you what the biggest FPS game in the world was, I imagine there'd be a few of the usual suspects coming to mind. Perhaps COD, PUBG, of course CSGO. Those would be at least some of the contenders that you might think of. But what you wouldn't think of though is a game called Crossfire. Unbelievably, Crossfire is the biggest FPS game in the world, and yet you've probably never heard of it. Let's touch on something quite obvious first. This game is old. Very old. It's pretty obvious just by looking at it that this is not a modern game, and when you're playing the game, that becomes even more apparent. Incredibly, this game released in 2007, 12 years ago, and yet it somehow looks worse than Counter-Strike 1.6, which was released around 7 years previous to that. Crossfire runs on the Lithtech Jupiter engine, which may not sound very familiar, but you will definitely recognise some of the games that it's powered. It was developed by Monolith Productions, and it was used to run games such as Fear and Fear 2 by Monolith themselves, and more recently Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, the first game from 2014, albeit that was a heavily modified version of the engine. And guess what? The base engine was very comparable with older engines such as the Quake engine or the early Unreal engine, of course being updated and changed a lot over the course of time. However, with Crossfire, it doesn't seem to have changed all that much. As we all know though, visuals are not everything, and it's the gameplay that matters the most. It's not unintentional that I used Counter-Strike as a comparison earlier, because Crossfire was absolutely influenced by and sometimes completely copied Counter-Strike at the time. The core gameplay feels very similar to Counter-Strike in its design. In Crossfire you have two teams, the Blacklist and Global Risk, who are both mercenary corporations. It may not quite be T's and CT's, but it's the same principle. There is a search and destroy mode that acts much like Counter-Strike's defuse mode too. Alongside that though, there are a significant amount of other modes in here, from free-for-all, elimination, team deathmatch, shadow mode, even down to mutation modes where players turn into mutants. Pretty self-explanatory, that one. You may recognise some of the maps too. Crossfire has a map called Desert 2.0, and it's almost a carbon copy of Dust 2 from Counter-Strike. Crossfire has some crazy cosmetic items as well. Weapon skins are out there, and some of the player models are wild too. In terms of the back end, well, it really feels like an old game. The entire user interface is archaic, even by 2007's standards. I couldn't even play the game in 1440p. It just wouldn't let me. And not only that, but when I finally did get into a game, I noticed a big issue with the mouse. It felt as though it was moving around on its own whenever I was aiming, to the point where I had to stop playing the game and do some research because it was unplayable. And as it turns out, the game struggles if you have a mouse running at more than 125 or 250 Hz on the polling rate, which honestly is most gaming mice nowadays. So once I manually turned my mouse down to 125 Hz in the software, it worked fine. Well, mostly. Nothing about this game on the surface says that it's the biggest FPS game in the world, and yet somehow it is, and that is all thanks to China. Crossfire is developed by a company called Smilegate, and they are a South Korean game developer and publisher, but the game was released in China by none other than Tencent Games. Now, it's possible there might be some of you watching this who don't know who Tencent are, but they are a massive entertainment company and the world's biggest gaming company. But their interests move well beyond gaming. They are one of the most valuable tech companies worldwide. Let's just say they're a big deal. They own almost half of Epic Games, and we know what Epic Games make: Fortnite. 5% of Blizzard, 5% of Ubisoft, roughly 10% of Bluehole, the guys that made PUBG, and 100% of Riot Games. So that should tell you just how many fingers in how many pies they have spread out across the gaming world. In terms of numbers, it's staggering. In 2014, Crossfire, the game that you're watching now, earned a whopping $957 million from microtransactions. In 2018, that revenue was up to around 1.3 billion from data supplied by Superdata. 1.3 billion from a free-to-play game. Let's just put that into perspective for a second. In 2018, Crossfire was 5th on the list of the biggest free-to-play earners, and it will probably come as no surprise to anyone that at the top of that list was Fortnite, which earned 2.4 billion. And then you've got Dungeon Fighter Online, League of Legends, and Pokemon Go. The shocking part here is that I think if you go to most people, have you heard of Fortnite? They will absolutely say yes. Kids, adults, parents, in one way or another, I'm sure that they've heard of the name Fortnite. It's mainstream. However, if you ask the same people if they've heard of Crossfire, the answer is going to be a resounding no. And that's because Crossfire has got most of its success from the Asian markets. It's available over here in Europe, but its popularity here is nothing like it is over in China and Korea. Also, this is incredible to think that Fortnite is available on multiple platforms. Crossfire is a PC-only game currently, although there are plans to bring it to console, and you can see why. But what about player numbers? And this is where it gets really staggering. How many people are actually playing Crossfire regularly? Well, first of all, Smilegate, the developers, have said that Crossfire has over 650 million players worldwide, and they claim that their record for concurrent players was 8 million. That's concurrent, people playing at the same time, although no word on exactly when that was or where it's sat at right now. Even still, if true, that is an astonishing number for a concurrent player count. If you remember, Fortnite hit 8.3 million concurrent players last year at its peak. It's gone down since then, and we all know that at one point PUBG was around the 3.2 million mark on Steam. But if we look at the Steam stats today, Dota is around 650k, CSGO at around 560k, and then PUBG just over 700k. So it's unbelievable to think that Crossfire just in China has more concurrent players than all of those massive games combined. So with all of that in mind, you probably won't be surprised to hear that Microsoft has decided to partner with Smilegate to bring a version of Crossfire to the Xbox. It's a smart move. In 2020, Crossfire X will release, a new updated version of the game designed specifically for console. Not only that, but Smilegate are also working on Crossfire HD, an HD version of the game that will bring it a lot closer to modern day standards in terms of the mechanics and visuals. Now, don't get too carried away, it's a big change. It's essentially an HD remaster. They are, however, supposedly working on a direct sequel, Crossfire 2. So I imagine that that's where the big improvements will come. And then, yes, of course, we've got the mobile version of the game coming too. Mobile games bring in an incredible amount of revenue for these companies. Games like PUBG and Fortnite do so well on mobile that bringing a game like Crossfire across to that platform is just a no-brainer. And it's going to make a ridiculous amount of cash. Wrapping things up, it's unbelievable to think that a game as successful as Crossfire really isn't familiar to a lot of people in the Western entertainment world. But this is a game that has grossed over $10 billion in lifetime revenue as of last year. $10 billion. That's just a monumental sum of money and an incredible achievement. One of the reasons I think it's so popular in China though is the same reason that Counter-Strike took off all of those years ago. The core gameplay is incredibly simple. You've got a small selection of weapons and it's just plant the explosives and shoot the bad guys. Easy to pick up, hard to master, much like Counter-Strike. Of course, it's hard to get past some of the obvious flaws of the game, and the fact that I felt like I was playing a cheap knockoff of Counter-Strike 1.6 at times, but you do get a similar feeling playing both games. It definitely has that feel to it. Another reason it's so popular, which ironically I think is a downside in the West, is the visuals. The game doesn't look very good, but that means that it runs well on pretty much any PC hardware that you can throw at it. The Chinese market tend to levitate to games like this that don't take supercomputers to run well. World of Warcraft is still extremely popular in China, probably for a similar reason. It runs on almost any PC. If you've got an 8-year-old computer that you haven't upgraded, hey, no big deal, download Crossfire, it's going to run. Looking to the future, I think one of the problems that Smilegate will face with this game is arguably the exact same one that Valve faced when they first released Counter-Strike Source and then Counter-Strike Go. How many of the new players will transition from the old game, especially when the original has a full cosmetic system in place that you assume players have spent a significant amount of money on building up their collections. Their core system relies on players spending money, of course, but if history is to be considered, I'm not sure that they will have a big issue on that front. And just to add another element into the mix, thanks to this partnership with Microsoft, Remedy Studios is also making a single player story element for future Crossfire titles such as Crossfire 2 and Crossfire X. You've probably heard of Remedy. They're most well known for the Max Payne games as well as Alan Wake, and more recently Quantum Break and their new game Control. Remedy are a very well-known studio in the West, and to have someone like that on board that's got experience at making successful single-player games, I think that's a good move for Crossfire. With all that said, Crossfire, is it a good game? Well, I've been playing it a bit, and it's not a game that I'm going to go back to after this video. Maybe I'll check out the new version when that's out, but given the numbers, I don't think they're going to miss me. That being said, it will definitely be interesting to see what the new Crossfire X game and possibly the sequel are going to offer up when they are released. Could they challenge CSGO? I suppose in numbers, they already have. They've trampled them. But when this game comes to the West, we'll see how it fares. And that's all for today, folks. Do let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. If you didn't, a dislike. Subscribe for more, hit that bell for all notifications, and I'll see you in the next one.